The first time I heard the drums, I thought they were my own heartbeat. Sergeant Brun Hesk had served the Emperor for 23 years. 23 years of mud and blood, of screaming orders over the thunder of artillery, of watching good men die for inches of worthless ground. His left shoulder bore the scars of an orc chopper that had nearly severed his arm on Gorgo Prime. His right temple carried the puckered mark where shrapnel from a heretic's grenade had kissed him on the killing fields of Mordia. Secundus. These were the wounds that showed. The ones that didn't, the ones carved deep into his mind by 2 decades of perpetual war. Those ran deeper than any blade could reach. The drums began on Carthax II during the 3rd month of what the strategists called Operation Righteous Cleansing. The name was a lie, of course. There was nothing righteous about what we did there. The planet had been a paradise, once an agri-world where golden wheat swayed under twin sons and children played in fields that stretched to the horizon. When the heretics came, when they poisoned the wells and burned the granaries and raised their blasphemous temples to dark gods, paradise became purgatory. I remember the morning it started. Dawn came red over the trenches, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. The air tasted of cordite and decay, that familiar cocktail of war that had become as familiar to me as my mother's cooking had been back when I still remembered her face. The 47th Cadian shock had been holding the line for 6 weeks, dug in like ticks on a corpse, waiting for the order that would send us over the top into another meat grinder. Braun stood at the edge of the fire trench, his last pistol heavy in his scarred hands. The weapon had seen as much war as he had, its metal worn smooth by countless battles, its power cell housing cracked and repaired a dozen times over. Below him, his squad prepared for another day of killing. Trooper Marcus cleaned his lost gun with the methodical precision of a man who understood that a dirty weapon meant death. Corporal Vex checked and rechecked his grenade harness, counting the frags like prayer beads. Young K, barely 18 and still soft around the edges despite 6 months of warfare, stared out at no man's land with eyes that had seen too much for his years. Sergeant. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Cordwer, a pale man with nervous hands, who had arrived 2 weeks ago, fresh from the Scola, and still believed in glory. Command wants us to probe the heretic positions. Sector 7, Alpha, grid reference. I listened to the coordinates with half an ear. Numbers on a map, meaningless designations for pieces of ground that would be soaked with blood before the day was done. The lieutenant's voice faded into the background noise of war, the constant low rumble of distant artillery, the crack of sniper fire, the wet sounds of wounded men crying for their mothers in the medical bunkers. That was when I heard it. Beneath the chaos of battle, beneath the lieutenant's nervous chatter and the morning prayers of the dying, there was something else. A rhythm, deep and primal, like the beating of a massive heart buried somewhere beneath the earth. Thump, 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 thump. Thump, thump. At first, I thought it was my pulse pounding in my ears, the way it sometimes did when the adrenaline spiked before a charge. But this was different. This came from outside, from somewhere beyond the trenches, beyond the war itself. It called to something inside me, something that had been sleeping for 23 years of loyal service. Sergeant Hesk, are you listening? Cordwer's voice had taken on an edge of irritation. Officers didn't like being ignored, especially by non-commissioned men who had forgotten more about war than they would ever learn. Yes, sir. The words came automatically learned through decades of military conditioning. Sector 7 Alpha Recon in force. Assess enemy. Strength and disposition. Precisely. Take your squad forward at 0900. Try not to get them all killed, Sergeant. The lieutenant walked away, his boots squatching in the perpetual mud that lined the trenches. He would be dead within a month. I knew they all were. These fresh-faced officers with their dreams of promotion and their leather-bound copies of the Imperial Guard manual. The war would chew them up and spit out their bones just as it had chewed up all the others. But the drums continued. I tried to shake the sound from my head, rolling my shoulders and working my neck until the joints cracked. The rhythm persisted. Steady and insistent, matching the pace of my breathing. It wasn't unpleasant. Exactly. If anything, it felt natural, like a song I had once known but forgotten. Like coming home after a long journey. All right, you worthless dogs. I barked at my squad, falling into the familiar cadence of command. We're going over the top in 30 minutes. Check your weapons. Check your armor. Check the man next to you because his life might be the only thing standing between you and a heretic's blade. The men responded with the practiced efficiency of veterans. Even young Kane moved with purpose now, his hands steady as he chambered a fresh power cell into his las gun. These were good soldiers, men I had trained and fought beside and bled with across half a dozen worlds. They deserved better than to die for inches of poisoned dirt on a planet whose name would be forgotten by history. The drums grew louder as we prepared to move out. They seemed to echo off the trench walls, reverberating through the packed earth and broken ferrocrete that formed our makeshift fortifications. I wondered if the others could hear them, too. But their faces showed no sign of recognition. Perhaps it was just me. Perhaps 23 years of war had finally caught up with the inside of my skull. At 0900 precisely, we went over the top. The no-man's land of Cardhax Iith stretched before us like a vision of the hell that awaited the unfaithful. Shell craters filled with stagnant water reflected the bloody sky. Coils of razor wire glinted with morning dew that looked suspiciously like tears. The bodies of previous assaults lay scattered across the torn ground, some in the uniform of the guard, others wearing the crude armor and blasphemous symbols of the heretics. The dead made no distinction between loyalty and treachery. They were all just meat now, left to rot under alien suns. We moved in standard formation, Vex on point. Marcus and Kane covering the flanks. Myself bringing up the rear with the Vox unit crackling against my back. The going was slow. Every step a negotiation with the sucking mud and twisted metal that carpeted the battlefield. Somewhere ahead, the heretics waited in their own trenches, just as cold and miserable as we were, just as ready to die for their convictions. The drums continued their relentless rhythm, and I found myself moving to their beat. Step, step, step. My boots squelched in perfect time with the phantom percussion that filled my head. It gave me strength somehow. Made each step feel lighter despite the weight of my gear. Made the lost gun in my hands feel like an extension of my own body rather than just another piece of military hardware. Contact front. Vex whispered into his microbead. 200m fortified position. Looks like a listening post. I crawled forward through the muck until I could see what he was talking about. A cluster of sandbags and broken ferrocrete formed a rough circle around what had once been a civilian dwelling. The windows had been blocked with metal plates. Gun ports cut at strategic intervals. Smoke drifted from a makeshift chimney carrying the smell of cooking meat that made my stomach growl despite the circumstances. How many? I asked. Hard to tell, Sergeant. I count at least 4, maybe 6. Light weapons, nothing we can't handle. Standard procedure would have been to call in artillery to rain down Emperor's wrath from above until nothing remained but crater and corpses. But artillery was precious on Karth's Iyeth, and command had made it clear that every shell needed to count. We would have to take the position the hard way with last fire and steel and the kind of close-quarters butchery that separated soldiers from civilians. The drums pounded harder as I studied the heretic position. My pulse quickened and I could feel something stirring in my chest, something that had been dormant for too long. It was anticipation, I told myself, the natural response of a veteran soldier preparing for combat. Nothing more than that. Marcus Caney, you'll provide covering fire from that shell crater to our left, I said, pointing to a depression that would give them a clear line of sight to the enemy. Position. Vex, you're with me. We'll work our way around to the right flank. Try to get behind them before they know we're here. What about prisoners? Sergeant Ka asked. Command wanted intelligence on their numbers and dispositions. I looked at the young trooper for a long moment, remembering when I had been like him. When I still believed that wars could be fought cleanly, that there was honor to be found in the killing fields, that the Emperor's light could shine through even the darkest campaigns. That innocence was precious, and part of me wanted to preserve it for as long as possible. But the drums were getting louder now, and with them came a hunger I had never felt before. A need that went beyond duty or tactics, or the simple desire to survive. Another day. I wanted to see blood. I wanted to hear screams. I wanted to feel bones break under my hands and watch the light fade from enemy eyes as they realized that their dark gods could not save them from the fury of the Imperial Guard. No prisoners, I heard myself say. Kill them all. The words surprised me. In 23 years of service, I had always followed the rules of engagement, always tried to conduct myself with the honor befitting a servant of the throne. Prisoners were valuable. Intelligence was crucial. Unnecessary killing served no tactical purpose and reflected poorly on the regiment's discipline. But as soon as I spoke the words, they felt right, natural, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting to open for decades. We moved into position with the practiced stealth of veteran soldiers. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled, every heartbeat synchronized with the phantom drums that continued to thunder in my skull. The sound was so loud now that I couldn't understand how the others failed to hear it. It seemed to shake the very ground beneath our feet, to echo off the clouds and reverberate through the bones of the earth itself. The first heretic died, without ever knowing we were there. Vex put a lust bolt through his head as the man stood up to stretch his back, probably tired from a long night of standing watch. The corpse toppled backward into the fortified position, and I heard shouts of alarm from the others inside. "Now!" I roared, and we were moving. The next few minutes became a blur of violence and noise. Last fire crackled through the air, painting everything in strobing red light. The heretics returned fire with autoguns and stubbers, filling the air with the angry buzz of solid projectiles. Someone was screaming, though I couldn't tell if it was one of ours or one of theirs. I vaulted over the sandbag wall and landed in the middle of their position. A heretic swung at me with a combat knife, the blade whistling past my throat as I twisted away. My last pistol barked twice, both shots taking the man's center mass. He dropped like a sack of grain, his weapon clattering away across the ferrocrete floor. Another heretic emerged from a side room, a heavy stubber clutched in his hands. The weapon was massive, designed for suppressing entire squads rather than engaging single targets. But at this range, it would tear me in half if he managed to bring it to bear. I could see his finger tightening on the trigger, see the muzzle swinging around to track me. The drums reached a crescendo, and time seemed to slow. I moved without thinking, my body acting on instincts I didn't know I possessed. The last pistol dropped from my nerveless fingers as I lunged forward, covering the distance between us in a single bound. My hands found the heretic's throat, fingers digging deep into flesh that felt warm and soft and infinitely fragile. The stub fired once, the shot going wild. And then I was crushing his windpipe with strength that seemed to come from somewhere outside myself. He tried to fight back, clawing at my hands, beating against my chest with fists that felt like gentle rain, but it was useless. I was stronger than I had ever been, filled with power that flowed through me like liquid fire. The heretic's eyes bulged in their sockets, his face turning purple as I squeezed the life from his body. I could feel his pulse fluttering against my thumbs, could hear the wet rattle as his lungs fought for air that would never come. And I laughed. The sound that came from my throat was not the laugh of Sergeant Braunesque, loyal servant of the throne. It was something darker, hungrier, filled with joy at the sight of suffering and death. The heretics' struggles grew weaker, and my laughter grew louder until it seemed to drown out even the thunder of the drums that continued to pound in my skull. When the heretic finally went limp, I held him there for another few seconds, savoring the weight of his corpse in my hands. Then I let him drop and turned to find the rest of my squad staring at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. "Sector clear," Vex reported, his voice carefully neutral. 6 hostiles down, no friendly casualties. "Good work," I said, surprised at how normal my voice sounded. "Sweep the position for intelligence and usable supplies. We'll hold here for 15 minutes, then continue the patrol." The men moved to obey, but I could feel their eyes on me as they worked. They had seen something in those moments of violence, something that disturbed them more than the simple fact of killing enemies. I wanted to reassure them, to explain that nothing had changed, that I was still the same sergeant who had led them through 2 dozen campaigns. But that would have been a lie. Something had changed when I felt the heretic's life drain away beneath my fingers. Something fundamental had shifted inside me, like a door opening onto a room I had never known existed. The drums were quieter now, satisfied for the moment, but they had not stopped entirely. They would never stop entirely. I realized they were part of me now, as much a part as my heartbeat or my breath. We found little of intelligence value in the heretic position. A few maps marked with positions that had probably changed since they were drawn. Some personal effects that told us nothing we didn't already know about enemy morale and supply lines. A Vox unit that had been damaged beyond repair. Its circuits melted by what looked like deliberate sabotage. What we did find were the bodies of 3 Imperial citizens. Civilians who had been captured during the heretics' advance across the agricultural districts. They had been tortured extensively before they died. Their flesh marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. One of them had been skinned alive, another disemboweled while still breathing. The third had simply been beaten to death with crude implements. His skull caved in by repeated blows. Looking at those bodies, I felt the drums quicken again. But this time, the rhythm was different. This time, there was anger mixed with the hunger, a righteous fury that demanded satisfaction. These heretics had tortured innocents, had defiled the Emperor's subjects for their own twisted pleasure. They deserved more than simple death. They deserved to suffer as their victims had suffered. "Throne, preserve us," whispered young Cain, his face pale, as he stared at the mutilated corpses. How could anyone do this to another human being? "They're not human anymore," I said. And the words carried more truth than I had intended. The moment they turned from the Emperor's light, they became something else, something that needs to be destroyed. We left the listening post behind and continued our patrol. But the sight of those tortured civilians stayed with me. Every step we took, every breath we drew was bringing us closer to more heretics. More servants of the dark gods who thought they could defile the Emperor's realm with impunity. More enemies who needed to learn the price of their blasphemy. The drums agreed with me. They pounded in my skull with increasing intensity. Each beat a promise of violence to come. I found myself walking faster, pushing the pace until my squad had to scramble to keep up. There were more heretics out here somewhere. More enemies waiting to be found and killed. And made to pay for their crimes. I wanted to find them. I needed to find them. We encountered our next targets 2 hours later at a crossroads where the remains of an Imperial shrine marked what had once been a place of worship. The heretics had defiled it naturally, covering the Emperor's sacred imagery with their blasphemous symbols, hanging rotting corpses from the aquila that had once crowned the structure. They had made it into a monument to their false gods, a celebration of everything that was wrong with the galaxy. There were more of them this time, at least a dozen, maybe 15, armed with a mixture of military weapons and improvised tools. They had set up a checkpoint at the crossroads, stopping any traffic that tried to pass through their territory. As we watched from concealment, a civilian ground car approached the position. I could see a family inside. A man and woman with two small children, probably trying to flee the fighting that had consumed their world. The heretics dragged them from the vehicle. What happened next was exactly what I had expected. The civilians were herded into the defiled shrine, their screams echoing off the broken walls as the heretics began their work. I had seen this before. On other worlds, in other wars, it was always the same. The servants of chaos took pleasure in suffering, fed on terror and despair like vampires feeding on blood. "We have to help them," Kin whispered, his young face twisted with anguish as the screams continued. "It's too late for that," Vex replied, his voice flat with the resignation of experience. "There are too many of them, and we're too far away. By the time we could get there, it would be over." He was right, of course. Tactically, it made no sense to expose our small squad to superior numbers in a prepared position. The correct course of action would be to observe the enemy positions, gather intelligence on their numbers and dispositions, then withdraw and report our findings to command. That was what the manual said. That was what 23 years of training had taught me. But the drums were screaming now, drowning out rational thought with their thunderous rhythm. The sound of civilian suffering mixed with the beat in my skull until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Something hot and red was building behind my eyes. A pressure that demanded release. "No," I said, standing up from our concealment. "We're going in, Sergeant." "That's suicide," Vex protested. "There are too many of them. We need to fall back and call for support." I turned to look at my corporal, this man who had served faithfully at my side for 3 years, who had saved my life twice and whom I had saved in return. His face was calm and professional, the expression of a soldier who understood the realities of warfare. But behind his eyes, I could see something else. Fear. Not fear of death. That was something we had all learned to live with long ago. Fear of me. Fear of what I was becoming. "We're going in," I repeated. And this time, my voice carried an authority that borked no argument. "That's an order, Corporal." The attack that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced in 2 decades of warfare. We moved like shadows given form, like the Emperor's own angels of death descending upon the unfaithful. My last pistol sang its deadly song, each shot finding its mark with precision that seemed impossible. A heretic's head exploded in a spray of blood and brains. Another doubled over as a last bolt punched through his chest, cooking his internal organs in their own juices. But it was not the ranged combat that satisfied the hunger growing inside me. It was the close work, the intimate killing that the drums demanded. When my power cell ran dry, I drew my chainsword and waded into the enemy ranks like a man possessed. The first heretic tried to block my strike with his autogun. The chainsword's teeth chewed through the weapon's barrel and continued into the man's chest, opening him from collarbone to sternum. Blood sprayed across my face, warm and copper-tasting, and I found myself grinning beneath my helmet. A second heretic came at me from the side, a crude axe raised above his head. I ducked, under his swing and brought my blade up in a diagonal cut that opened his belly like a ripe fruit. His entrails spilled out onto the ground, steaming in the cool morning air, and he looked down at them with an expression of comic surprise before toppling forward. The third one begged for mercy. He was young, probably no older than Kyn, with the soft features of someone who had lived most of his life in comfort. His weapon lay forgotten on the ground, and he held his hands up in surrender, tears streaming down his cheeks as he babbled, pleas for his life. Please, he said, his voice cracking with terror. I don't want to die. I have a family, children. Please don't kill me. I should have accepted his surrender. The rules of engagement were clear on this point. Enemy combatants who laid down their arms and offered no resistance were to be taken prisoner for interrogation. It was not only tactically sound, it was morally right. The Emperor's servants did not murder helpless opponents. But the drums had reached a fever pitch now. And through their thunder, I could hear something else. Laughter, deep and rich. And infinitely cruel, the kind of laughter that echoed from fighting pits and execution grounds. It was coming from somewhere far away, from a realm of brass and blood, where warriors fought eternal battles for the amusement of dark gods. It was also coming from my own throat. Your family is already dead, I told the young heretic and raised my chainsaw above my head. Your children are rotting in mass graves. Your wife is feeding the worms and now it's your turn. The blade came down and his pleas turned to screams and the screams turned to silence. When it was over, when the last heretic lay twitching in his own blood, I stood in the center of the slaughter and felt something I had not experienced in 23 years of warfare. Satisfaction. Not the grim pleasure of duty fulfilled or objectives completed, but genuine satisfaction. The hunger in my chest had been fed, and it wanted more. My squad approached cautiously, their weapons lowered but not holstered, their eyes fixed on me with expressions that mixed respect with something approaching fear. They had seen me fight before, had watched me lead charges and hold lines and do all the things that sergeants were supposed to do. But this had been different. This had been personal. The civilians, Khorne said quietly, gesturing toward the shrine where the screaming had finally stopped. I walked to the defiled building and stepped inside. The family from the ground car lay scattered across the floor, their bodies arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The heretics had worked quickly, but they had been thorough. Even the children bore the marks of their attention, small forms broken and twisted in ways that would haunt my dreams for years to come, if I still dreamed at all. Burn it, I ordered, my voice harsh with suppressed emotion. Burn it all. Let nothing remain of their blasphemy. Vex produced a frag grenade from his harness and set the timer for 30 seconds. We withdrew to a safe distance and watched as the shrine erupted in a ball of fire and shrapnel. The flames caught quickly in the dry wood and cloth that the heretics had used to defile the sacred space. Within minutes, the entire structure was engulfed, sending a pillar of black smoke into the sky that could probably be seen for kilometers. That'll bring every heretic in the sector down on our heads, Marcus observed, checking his chronometer. We should move, Sergeant. Get back to friendly lines before they organize a response. He was right, of course. setting fire to enemy positions was an excellent way to announce your presence to anyone within visual range. Standard procedure would have been to conduct our reconnaissance as quietly as possible, avoiding contact when feasible, engaging only when necessary to complete the mission. But standard procedure seemed less important now than it had that morning. The drums in my skull had changed something fundamental about my priorities. "Let them come," I said, slinging my chains across my back and checking the charge on my last pistol. "Let them all come." We took positions around the burning shrine and waited. The smoke rose higher into the morning sky, a beacon that called to every enemy in the sector. Somewhere out there, heretic commanders were receiving reports of the fire, dispatching squads to investigate, coordinating their response to what they probably assumed was a major Imperial assault. They would come in force, expecting to find a company or even a full regiment. Instead, they would find 4 guardsmen and a sergeant whose mind was slowly being eaten away by something that whispered of blood and skulls and endless war. The first response came within 20 minutes. A squad of 12 heretics approached from the north, moving in a loose formation that spoke of decent training and battlefield experience. They were cautious, but not overly so, probably expecting to find the site already abandoned by whatever Imperial forces had been responsible for the fire. I let them get within 50 m before giving the order to engage. The opening volley cut down half of them before they even realized they were under attack. Last fire crackled through the air, painting everything in strobing red light, and the acrid smell of ozone mixed with the smoke from the burning shrine. The survivors sought cover behind a cluster of rocks that had once marked the boundary of the shrine's garden, returning fire with autoguns and las weapons of their own. Covering fire, I called to my squad and broke from concealment. What followed was not tactics in any sense that would be recognized by the scholar progenium. It was not the careful application of firepower and movement that had carried the Imperial Guard to victory on 1,000 worlds. It was something older and more primal. The kind of warfare that predated last weapons and powered armor and all the civilized trappings of modern conflict. It was slaughter. I covered the distance to the heretic position in seconds, moving faster than I had ever moved before. My legs pumped like pistons, each step eating up meters of ground. My body filled with strength that seemed to come from somewhere outside myself. A heretic rose up to meet me, his autogun chattering as he emptied a clip in my direction. The rounds passed so close I could feel their heat. But somehow none of them found their mark. My chainsaw took his head off at the shoulders. Blood fountained from the severed neck, splashing across my armor and face mask, and I could taste copper through the air recyclers. The drum beat in my skull reached a crescendo, and I threw back my head and roared my defiance at the sky. The sound that emerged from my throat was not entirely human anymore. The remaining heretics broke and ran. I pursued them across the broken ground, my sword singing as it carved through flesh and bone. One man made it almost 30 m before I brought him down, the chainsaw's teeth chewing through his spine just below the skull. Another tried to surrender, dropping his weapon and raising his hands in supplication. But the sight of his fear only fed the hunger that was consuming my mind. When it was over, I stood alone among the corpses, breathing heavily as the drums in my head gradually subsided to a more manageable level. My armor was painted with blood from head to foot, and steam rose from the superheated metal of my chainsaw's blade. In the distance, I could hear more vehicles approaching, drawn by the sound of battle. Sergeant Vex's voice came from behind me, carefully modulated to avoid giving offense. We should withdraw, establish a new observation post further from the contact site. I turned to face my squad, and saw them step back involuntarily. Even through their face masks, I could see their expressions. They were looking at me like they had never seen me before, like I was some stranger wearing their sergeant's uniform and carrying his weapons. Perhaps that was closer to the truth than any of us wanted to admit. No, I said, wiping blood from my chainsaw's blade with a piece of torn cloth. We hold here. Let them come to us. Sir, that's not tactically sound. Marcus ventured, his voice nervous. We're outnumbered at least 10-1. If we stay here, we'll be overrun. I looked at the trooper who had served under me for 2 years, who had followed me through the hell of Moria Secundus and the ice fields of Valhalla Prime. A good soldier, steady under fire, the kind of man who formed the backbone of the Imperial Guard. He deserved better than to die, because his sergeant's mind was being eaten away by something that whispered of blood and violence and endless war. But the drums were speaking again, and their voice was louder than the small part of me that still remembered duty and honor, and the oath I had sworn to protect the men under my command. We hold, I repeated, my voice carrying the finality of an executioner's axe. Anyone who doesn't like it can request a transfer. The next wave came from 2 directions simultaneously. 30 heretics from the east, another 20 from the south, moving with the coordination of units that had fought together before. They had learned from the fate of their comrades, approaching under cover of suppressing fire, using smoke grenades to mask their advance. It was a textbook assault, executed with the kind of precision that would have made their instructors proud back when they still served the Emperor. It didn't matter. The drums had reached a new level of intensity, and with them came strength that no mortal warrior should possess. I felt my muscles swelling beneath my armor, felt my bones growing denser and harder. My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged animal trying to break free. And when I opened my mouth to roar my challenge at the approaching enemy, the sound that emerged made the very air tremble. The battle that followed lasted 3 hours and left the ground carpeted with corpses. My squad fought with the desperate fury of men who knew they were doomed but refused to go quietly into the dark. Vex's grenade harness was empty within the first 30 minutes, each frag perfectly placed to maximize enemy casualties. Marcus burned through 4 power cells, his lasgen glowing cherry red from sustained fire. Young Cain proved that his soft appearance hit a warrior's heart, dropping heretic after heretic with shots that would have made a sniper proud. But it was not their efforts that turned the tide of battle. It was something else. Something that moved through the enemy ranks like a force of nature given flesh and armed, with a chainsaw that sang hymns of violence. I lost track of how many I killed that day. Dozens, certainly. Perhaps scores. They came at me in waves, and I cut them down like wheat before the scythe. my blade never slowing, my arm never tiring. With each death, the drums grew louder. With each spray of blood across my armor, the hunger in my chest swelled. I could feel something changing inside me, something fundamental shifting in ways that would have terrified the man I had been that morning. But terror seemed like a foreign concept now. Something that belonged to a different life, a different war, a different galaxy. All that mattered was the killing. When the last heretic fell, I stood in the center of a field of carnage that stretched for hundreds of meters in every direction. Bodies lay piled upon bodies, their blood soaking into the earth until the very ground seemed to weep red tears. The air was thick with the smell of death and cordite and something else, something that reminded me of hot metal and burning brass. My squad approached cautiously, picking their way through the corpses with expressions of stunned disbelief. They had witnessed something that day, something that would haunt their dreams for whatever remained of their lives. They had watched their sergeant become something else. Something that belonged more in the myths and legends of ancient terror than on a modern battlefield. "Emperor, preserve us," Kyn whispered, his young face pale as parchment. "What happened here, Sergeant? What happened to you?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words that emerged were not my own. They came from somewhere deeper, somewhere older. Somewhere that rire of brass and blood and the screams of the dying. "I have been awakened," I said, and my voice carried harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "I have heard the true music of war, and it is beautiful." Vex raised his las gun, his finger moving toward the trigger, but the weapon seemed to grow impossibly heavy in his hands. He staggered under its weight, confusion clear on his face as he struggled to bring the barrel to bear. The others tried to do the same, but their movements were sluggish, as if they were moving through thick liquid. I could feel it now, the power that flowed through me like molten metal in my veins. It was changing me, reshaping me, turning me into something that would serve purposes far grander than the petty wars of mortal men. The drums in my skull were no longer just sound. They were instruction, commandment, divine revelation whispered from a realm where gods walked among rivers of blood and mountains of skulls. "You served well," I told my squad, and part of me, some small part that still remembered who I had once been, meant those words sincerely. "But your war is ending. Mine is just beginning." I left them there among the corpses, walking away across the killing field toward distant horizons where greater battles waited. Behind me, I could hear them calling my name, their voices growing fainter with each step I took. They would report back to command, would tell their officers about what they had witnessed, would probably be declared insane and transferred to punishment battalions where their stories would be forgotten. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the drums that thundered in my skull and the hunger that gnawed at my chest like a living thing. Somewhere out there, more enemies waited, more battles to be fought, more blood to be spilled in service to powers that understood the true nature of the galaxy. The corruption that had begun as a whisper was becoming a roar. 3 days passed before I encountered another Imperial unit. 3 days of wandering across the war-torn landscape of Karthak-Scythe, following the sound of distant gunfire and the sweet scent of burning flesh. I had not eaten in all that time, nor slept, nor even paused to rest. The hunger that consumed me was not the mundane need for food or water or sleep. It was something far more fundamental, a craving that could only be satisfied with violence and death, and the terror in an enemy's eyes. My body had changed. During those 3 days of wandering, the muscles beneath my armor had swollen until the ceramite plates could barely contain them. My hands had grown larger, the fingers elongating into something more suited to tearing flesh than operating delicate machinery. When I caught my reflection in a puddle of stagnant water, the face that stared back was still recognizably mine, but altered. The eyes burned with an inner fire that had nothing to do with human emotion. The teeth had sharpened into points that would have made an orc proud. The drums never stopped. They pounded in my skull with the rhythm of a massive heart growing louder with each passing hour. Each beat synchronized with the pulse of blood through my expanding veins. Sometimes I could hear other sounds mixed with the percussion. Screams, laughter, the ring of steel on steel, the wet sound of blade parting flesh. It was beautiful music, the symphony of eternal war played on instruments of bone and sinew. I found the Imperial patrol at dawn on the 4th day. A squad of Mordian Iron Guard advancing through a ruined township that had once housed agricultural workers. They moved with the rigid discipline that their regiment was famous for. Their uniforms, immaculate despite weeks in the field, their weapons maintained to parade ground standards. There were 8 of them, led by a young lieutenant whose mustache was waxed to regulation perfection. They saw me approaching across the rubble-strewn street and immediately brought their las guns to bear. Professional soldiers responding to a potential threat with appropriate caution. The lieutenant stepped forward, his weapon held at the ready but not quite aimed at my chest. "Halt," he called out in the crisp accent of Mordian nobility. "Identify yourself." I stopped. 20 m away, studying them with eyes that no longer saw fellow servants of the Emperor. Instead, I saw obstacles, impediments to the greater purpose that was slowly consuming my mind. The drums in my skull quickened, and I could feel saliva gathering in my mouth at the thought of what was to come. "Sergeant Braun Hesk, 47th Caddy in shock," I replied, my voice carrying harmonics that made several of the Mordians step back involuntarily. "And you are trespassing on my hunting ground." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed as he took in my appearance. Even at this distance, he could see that something was wrong. My armor was caked with dried blood from a dozen different sources. My weapons were stained red to the hilt. The smell of death and corruption clung to me like a second skin. "You look like you've been through hell, Sergeant," the lieutenant said, lowering his weapon slightly. "When did you last report to command? We've had reports of isolated units going missing in this sector." I smiled and the expression felt wrong on my face. Too wide, too many teeth. "I serve a different command now," I said, and drew my chainsaw. The blade ignited with a sound like screaming souls, its teeth spinning so fast they became a blur of steel and ceramite. The weapon had changed along with me, growing larger and heavier, its machine spirit corrupted by the same forces that were remaking my flesh. Runes of brass and bone had appeared along its length, symbols that hurt to look at directly, and whispered promises of endless slaughter. The lieutenant opened his mouth to shout an order, but I was already moving. The corruption had made me faster than any human had a right to be. I crossed the 20 between us and the space between heartbeats, my chainsaw describing a perfect arc that took the lieutenant's head clean off his shoulders. Blood fountained from the severed neck, painting the morning sky in shades of crimson, and his body took 2 more steps before collapsing. The Mordians opened fire. Last bolts crackled through the air around me, but they might as well have been gentle rain for all the effect they had. The power that flowed through my veins made me faster, stronger, more resilient than mortal flesh should ever be. When a shot did find its mark, it barely scorched my corrupted armor, the metal plates having grown thicker and more resistant to damage. I moved among them like death incarnate, my chainsaw singing its hymn of destruction. The first Mordian tried to bayonet me, thrusting his weapon at my chest with parade ground precision. I caught the rifle by its barrel and crushed it in my grip, then backhanded him with enough force to cave in his skull. The second one screamed as my blade opened him from groin to throat, spilling his organs onto the broken concrete. The third one ran. I pursued him through the ruins of the township, my feet barely touching the ground as I bounded from rubble pile to collapsed wall. The Mordian was young and fit, probably a champion runner back on his home world, but he might as well have been standing still for all the good his speed did him. I caught him at the edge of what had once been the town's central square and lifted him off his feet by his throat. "Please," he gasped, his face turning purple as I squeezed. "I have a family, children. Please." The words were meaningless noise, no different from the bleating of livestock before slaughter. I had heard them before, would hear them again, would always hear them. Fear was the same in every language, on every world, in the voice of every species that had ever drawn breath in this galaxy. It was the one constant in a universe of variables, the one truth that transcended race and creed and allegiance. I crushed his windpipe and let his body fall. The remaining Mordians were already dead by the time I returned to the square. They had tried to establish a defensive position behind an overturned ground car, but it had done them no good. My chainsaw had carved through their cover as easily as their flesh, reducing both steel and bone to the same red ruin. I stood among the corpses and felt the drums reach a new crescendo in my skull. Each death had fed the hunger that consumed me, but it also created a greater appetite. Like a man dying of thirst who drinks salt water. Each kill only made me crave more. The corruption was accelerating now, reshaping not just my body, but my very soul, burning away everything that had once made me human and leaving only the purest essence of violence behind. That was when I heard the artillery. The sound came from the west, a distant thunder that spoke of heavy guns and massed firepower. Somewhere out there, the war was still being fought by ordinary men with ordinary weapons. Soldiers who still believed in duty and honor and the possibility of victory. They would be concentrated in large numbers. Hundreds or even thousands of combatants gathered in one place. A banquet of slaughter waiting to be consumed. I began walking toward the sound. My corrupted form moving with purpose across the devastated landscape. Behind me, the bodies of the Mordian patrol slowly cooled in the morning sun, their blood seeping into the thirsty earth. They had served their purpose, feeding the thing I was becoming, but they were just the appetizer before the main course. The drums in my skull had become a constant roar now, drowning out all other sounds except the distant rumble of artillery. Each step brought me closer to the source of the thunder, to the massed armies that would provide the feast I craved. I could smell them already. Thousands of warm bodies sweating in their trenches. Their blood just waiting to be spilled in honor of powers that understood the true nature of existence. I was no longer Sergeant Braun Hesk of the 47th Cadian Shock. That man had died. Somewhere in the ruins of Carthax too. His soul devoured by hungers too vast for mortal comprehension. What walked in his place was something else entirely. A creature of brass and blood and endless war shaped by forces that had existed since the birth of the galaxy. I was becoming what I had always been meant to be, a weapon, a killer, an avatar of the blood god's will, made manifest in flesh and bone and corrupted steel. The artillery grew louder as I approached the main battle lines, and with it came other sounds. The crack of lost gunfire, the scream of dying men, the roar of engines and the whistle of incoming shells. It was beautiful music. The symphony of war played at its grandest scale. Somewhere ahead, armies clashed in battles that would determine the fate of worlds. Their commanders moving pieces across boards they could not truly see. But I could see the corruption had opened my eyes to truths that lesser minds could not comprehend. This war, like all wars, was nothing more than a ritual. A sacrifice offered up to powers that fed on violence and death and the anguish of mortal souls. Every bullet fired, every blade thrust, every drop of blood spilled was an offering on altars built from the bones of the fallen, and I would be the high priest of that sacrifice. The Imperial forward positions came into view as the sun reached its zenith. Trenches and bunkers scarred the landscape for kilometers in every direction, filled with men who thought they were fighting for the Emperor, but were really serving a far older and hungrier god. Artillery pieces hurled their shells across no man's land with metronomic precision. Each explosion a prayer offered up to the altar of war. I could see the command bunker in the distance, its armored walls bristling with Vox aerials and OSPX arrays. Inside would be the officers and strategists who planned the movements of thousands, who decided which units lived and which died, who chose the time and place of each engagement. They thought they controlled the war, but they were as much prisoners of it as the lowliest trooper in the firing line. Soon they would learn the truth. Soon they would understand that there was only one God worth serving. Only one power that mattered in a galaxy drowning in its own blood. The drums in my skull had become a deafening roar. Now, so loud that I could barely hear my own thoughts over their thunder. But I no longer needed thoughts. Thought was for humans, and I had left humanity behind in the ruins of a defiled shrine and the corpses of men who had once called me sergeant. All I needed was the hunger. All I needed was the kill. I began walking toward the trenches, my corrupted form casting a shadow that seemed to writhe and dance with a life of its own. Behind me, the wind carried the scent of brass and burning blood, omens of the slaughter to come. Ahead. Thousands of soldiers went about their duties, unaware that death was walking among them in the shape of something that had once been their ally. The transformation was almost complete now. Soon there would be nothing left of Sergeant Braun Hesk except memories that would fade like smoke in the wind. In his place would stand a champion of the blood god, a creature whose only purpose was to spill blood in honor of the skull throne. But first, there was work to do. I reached the outer perimeter as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon. The sentries saw me approaching and raised their weapons. But something in my appearance gave them pause. I still wore the uniform of the Imperial Guard, still carried weapons. They recognized. The corruption was obvious to anyone who looked closely, but at a distance I might still pass for human. Halt, called one of the guards, a corporal with the weathered face of a veteran. State your name and unit. Sergeant Braun Hesk, I replied, my voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate. 47th Caddy in shock. I have intelligence for the command staff. The corporal hesitated, studying my appearance with the practiced eye of a soldier who had seen too much war. He could sense that something was wrong, but 20 years of military conditioning made it difficult for him to believe that a fellow guardsman might pose a threat. You look like you've been through the grinder. Sergeant, he said finally. When did you last have contact with your unit? I smiled and the expression split my face wider than human anatomy should have allowed. This morning, I said, but they're all dead now. The corporal's eyes widened as he began to understand, his finger moving toward the trigger of his las gun, but it was too late. Far too late. My chainsaw took his head before he could even begin to scream. The massacre that followed would be remembered in the annals of cart hacks.